My name is Vincent Pieribone. I'm an associate professor at Yale University and a fellow at the John B. Pierce Laboratory in New Haven. Oh, wow. Well, let's see. I was planning to be a physician, I guess, when I was very young. My father was a chiropractor. He had polio as a kid, and so he lost one of his legs and struggled a lot of his life with polio, and then ultimately got multiple sclerosis and passed away when I was very young. And so I think that probably the event of him passing away and sort of inspired me the most to go into what I thought at the time was sort of medical research and being a physician. But also had a actually very important high school science teacher who was really, helped me think about things in a scientific way and helped me be a little bit more. I grew up in a very small town in Florida, and education wasn't high on the priority list in our school. So he was like, stood out as kind of helping me in that process. And my father got very ill right around that time as well. So I guess I was both saddened and disheartened, but also a little bit angry about how the status of our understanding of these kind of diseases were. And so I kind of inspired me, I guess, to go on. And then in college, I sort of was going on as a physician because of ignorance, because I thought that they were the kind of people who did science and research around biology. And then I guess it was sort of at the end of my undergraduate career here at NYU that I sort of stupidly came to the conclusion that medical doctors don't really do most of the research in biomedicine, but it's Ph.D.s in university settings that do that kind of work. So that I started in a lab doing that, and that's history from there. The brain started because of my father, really, because multiple sclerosis is a disease of the nervous system. And I was reading a lot. I did a science project in high school about regenerating neurons, as my high school science project. And read a lot at the time and, thought it was very exciting. And the brain, I think, to me, has always remained the most fascinating organ in the body because it's so unknown and because it's the part of us that makes us human in many ways. Most of the rest of our organs are kind of the same in rats, but our brain is really the thing that makes us different, and it's certainly the most complicated and the least understood part of our body, and also the diseases are less treated, I think, than most. So that, I guess, neurophysiology stemmed from that, because neurophysiology is kind of the study of rapidly occurring events. I think of it as thought processes or things that everyday actions, as opposed to sort of molecular biology or genetics, which work on a slower time frames. I was most interested in cognition and how we make sense of our world and how we remember and how we think and what makes us human. And that neurophysiology kind of flowed from that for me. Well, sort of, it's kind of cliche, but kind of the greats, I guess. For me, Darwin was always important because of his ability to sort of leap beyond the current thought, and Einstein for his ability to kind of come up with ideas that seemed totally off the wall. Relativity was something that I guess was staring everybody in the face for years, and nobody really came up with it. And being able to think beyond that, to me, was so just the most creative thing I could think of in a human being, was being able to think beyond the world we live in, and Galileo with his, conceptualizing the solar system, and Copernicus seeing those things and, just fighting against this huge trend, or even Mendel, going through a whole life explaining some aspect of life and absolutely no one believing him, and him dying and no one ever believing him, and then, 50, 100 years later, everybody looks back and, he was really a genius. I guess those are the kind of larger people that I admired in life. Recent is hard to say. I mean, I don't want to be cynical and everything. It's just that the brain is just so incredibly complicated. Even in insects, it's actually so complicated. In other words, and to study it is so difficult. I think the difficulty in studying is what partially makes it so complicated without destroying it in some way. Certainly human brain is totally inaccessible, largely to scientists, because it's really just a part of a person's being, and you can't test it. The blood you can draw from people, or other organs or tissue you can even take, but the brain you really can't ever really study that closely without damaging it. So we've had to invent very creative ways to look at it, like MRI and these kind of things. But they're still limiting in the way that they've helped us understand. And certainly the human brain is always the one that's the most difficult to understand, because it's really the highest functioning, machine on the entire earth, without a doubt, because of the size and what it does and the constraints it has on it. It's just an absolutely amazing instrument, but it's also this incredibly difficult thing to get in and look at. And that's where my science That's why later in my life, in my career, I went into the direction of technology, trying to develop new ways to study it, because I think we're a little bit, it's kind of mean to say, but we're kind of a little stagnant right now, I think, unfortunately, really making these great leaps forward that we need. We all want to know these big questions that have been on our minds for hundreds of years about consciousness, about, even notions of morality and memory and things, all of which emanates from our brain, and we don't really get close to those, unfortunately, because the basic functional elements of the brain and how it does its little things still remain a mystery to us. And a lot of work has been done recently in animals to give us to understand how basic systems of sensory systems and things work. But even there, even sort of the rodent, whisker system, which has been heavily studied for years and years and years about how they look with their whiskers, how they feel with them. And it's a system which people have access to, but it still remains a mystery, amazingly enough, what it's able to do and how it does it, even though there's really thousands of papers published on it, actually. We haven't kind of made those leaps, I think, that all of us, especially me from when I was young, would have hoped we would be making by now. I was reading journals when I was in high school, 30 years ago, and I would imagine, it's going to be these great leaps. And we've seen leaps in our society around technology. We've seen leaps around thought, maybe even political, you could even say. But in this kind of science, although we've done a lot of work in it, and we've accumulated a lot of knowledge, but it hasn't answered the big questions yet. And that's disappointing to me, I have to say. But exciting in the same, because it offers a challenge. It's still out there as a challenge, So I always hope that we get better minds to continue to be applied to it, I guess. The amount of effort that it went into building an iPhone, has not really gone into effort to even understanding one aspect of the brain. And it would seem to be more important to me. And unfortunately, I think in our country, and maybe this is a generalization, but a lot of the best minds in our country don't go into science, at least academic science, like they used to. I think they tend to find their way in business and other areas that are maybe more lucrative or more seen as interesting, even medicine, than basic science. That's kind of sad to me. I'm amazed at how difficult it is to find really people who are really excited about doing this as it used to be. And with that change that I've noticed, funding is up, I guess, and we're very thankful to Obama for giving us lots of money last year as part of the ARA money. That was a huge boost. I think it was a huge emotional boost to scientists. I'll be completely honest with you. When we saw this money come out, we just assumed it was not going to go anywhere near us, and the NIH got an enormous boost, and it was just really breathtaking to all of us that the administration, that young administration, saw that much compelling interest in studying basic science, and it was very exciting, I have to say. I think NIH got more grants last year, submissions, than they've gotten probably in the past 10 years, because people were so excited about this. So funding's a big deal, really, and I'm always saddened by the fact that the technology that we use, unfortunately, is somewhat primitive compared to the technology, that took to make Avatar, right? I mean, it's the kind of beautiful, amazing stuff that our society has to work with sometimes doesn't trickle down to us, or trickles a little bit later to us that are trying to study these aspects of the brain. But it's not a complaint. It's just it would be nice to see that happen a little bit faster, I guess. This whole STEM concept that's in high schools now is absolutely the case. I mean, and I think people recognize it, but those are the hard things that kids unfortunately have to learn. It's just math. We need math and we need science. And technology. And I think that it sounds old-fashioned and everything, but that's the basics to which you'll be able to get into the rest of this stuff. I mean, what we are at in our understanding of the brain, of neuroscience, is a very high level. The complexity is quite high. In other words, being a neuroscientist it requires a multifaceted scientific knowledge, and you got to start really young to catch up there. Like any area of technology, you really need to be schooled in it very young. If you want to be, a cutting-edge programmer, or you want to work at Google, you really should be starting early and learning early. And I guess as long as we can excite students, I spend a lot of my time trying to go around to high schools and going to junior high schools, trying to inspire kids in this area, and make it a little bit less dry and a little bit less sort of perceived to be boring. Science fiction is huge, but it doesn't translate into science reality for students. They love to go see science fiction films, but they don't. I think science is probably not nearly as exciting today as the science fiction is. It's probably part of the problem. I got a lot of people show up in the lab and they think every day is going to be, like Mr. Spock running around on the deck of the Enterprise, making huge discoveries and stuff. And it's a little slow, It's a lot of pipetting, a lot of, things don't work. And like any job, it's really kind of like any job. So it's not like, we're out there in the field, weathering the storm and, doing that kind of field work as much as people probably think it is. So maybe that kind of gets people a little bit less enthused. But there are moments, in your career, you work very hard on something and suddenly there's that aha moment, which is, I don't think you get it in any other business. I can't imagine where you've discovered something for the first time. And at that moment that you're the only person in the entire world that knows that bit of information. You've just discovered the workings, some workings of the body, and maybe it's a little bit, but it'll end up in a journal. But you see it for the first time, and that's just, for me, I can never replace that. Even now, it's like a kid, to get that kind of feeling. It's just absolutely overwhelming. I can't imagine not getting that. I can't imagine a job where you didn't have that kind of feeling. So that's why I think it's just the most exhilarating job I could ever do. I can't imagine doing anything but it, because I get a chance to kind of play. I have a lab full of toys, and we get to work on projects, and we work on projects that have real meaning. People's lives are hanging in the balance of things we discover. And I'm exaggerating in what I do particularly, but each incremental thing we do shows up in textbooks, and you see it repeated later to you, and it's very exciting to know that you had some impact on that, whatever little bit it is. And so I think it's a thrilling business, and I think people stick in it long enough, they feel the same way. But maybe it's just the shock of getting into it and realizing they have to write grants and they have to teach and there's tenure and there's all the business of, but it's really not that bad. Let's see, big aha moments. That's interesting. One of the projects that I'm most excited about these days is trying to develop new ways of studying the brain. And one of the things I've been working on are optical methods of observing the brain. In other words, ways of literally visualizing brain function, so literally seeing when nerve cells are firing in response to something that's going on in real time, and having computers analyze these kind of images or movies of the brain and deriving an understanding of how the brain is processing the world around us. And the future of this is prosthetics and things like this. And we were developing a probe to try to do this, where we were combining something that glowed with something that sensed voltage. Voltage is the big thing that we're concerned about in the brain. Like, little nerve cells are changing their electrical potentials, and we'd like to see that. So we're creating these artificial proteins which combined naturally occurring things that sort of smell voltage and things that naturally give off light, and we put them together in various ways. And 90% of them don't work at all. It's very frustrating. But I plotted out a whole series of experiments for my graduate student that you should insert it here, you should insert these two together there. And of course, everything that I suggested didn't work. And at the end, he said, in the middle of our discussion, he said, well, I want to make this kind of a combination. And I said, well, that's foolhardy because you're a student and don't know better. And of course, that's the only one that did work at the end of the day. So I was, eating crow for a long time. But it was that moment when we had gone through a lot of these and things didn't look very good. And, he's sort of looking at me like I think he's crazy and I think I made a mistake by doing my thesis with him, And then you put the one in and, it happens, and you're watching it. And of course, the first impression is, okay, something's wrong, because it's working. So we've done something wrong. So we literally spent a week saying, okay, let's just do it again because there's something wrong. It looks too good, And but then after a week, we're kind of like, because the worst thing to happen is you get all excited about something and then you find out it's some idiotic mistake that you left a switch wrong, and you see, of course we've done that more often than not. And this was that kind of moment for me where, I don't know when it was during the week, where I kind of find, this may actually be real, And there was one aspect of the way that this construct we made that was responding that didn't make sense to me. I didn't think it, that's why I thought it was kind of not real. And I showed it to a friend at Yale, and he said, oh no, that's how it should act because of this that you didn't know about. And when I learned that, I said, oh, then it is doing what it's supposed to be doing, And then I got very excited. And then it all started to come together. And that was a moment of, for him and for the student, I guess he was also sighing a relief that he was going to finally graduate, But it's just this idea that, wow, it worked. I can't believe we did this, and something actually came out of it, And so that followed to study that, and then he ultimately got his thesis and graduated and worked for McKinsey, So there goes that. But he was a good scientist, and he finished, and he went on back to Japan and worked in a different job. But it was that moment, and I think he still sees it. He writes me all the time from his job and how he misses that emotional feeling of, And then we went on to make lots of different variations on that, each of which had its own little personality, and that's kind of a moment. And recently we had the same experience just about 2 weeks ago in the lab, modifying these things again, where something that we didn't think would work did. And it's little things, not things that are going to end up on the cover of the Times, but there are things that are incrementally moving us forward, And we know that all the people in our business are going to be really impressed by us, and that's what makes us happy. We know that when we go to a meeting, someone's going to go, wow, that's cool, And that's the gratification that we need, because it's our peers saying, God, I know how much work that must have been, and you must have been really excited, Yeah, so I guess about a while back, it was 5 or 6 years ago, I was struck by a couple of things happened in my life, and one of them was I saw a couple of movies. One was The Diving Bell and the Butterfly, about this sort of high cervical injury, spinal cord injury patient who ended up writing this whole book by blinking his eyes. It's really a beautiful story, and the movie I thought was really well done and sad. But this notion that when you get spinal cord damage, high cervical, meaning high up in the neck, you lose all the ability to use your lower organs. In other words, you use the ability to move, muscular, motor, and sensory. And it's a kind of a thing they call lock-in syndrome, which is basically the brain is completely functioning, and generally your visual system is generally okay because that enters your brain above the spinal cord. Most of the upper cranial nerves come in, so they can usually move their mouths, and sometimes they can breathe and things like this. But essentially, they have no control over their lower body. And when we were writing this book, we interviewed a kid who, was graduating high school and got into a fight on the night of his graduation, and someone cut him in the neck with a knife, and he was paralyzed like this when he was like 18. And now he's, I don't know, so it's 25, 30, something around that age, and has just been living in this essential prison. It's just this horrible. It's horrible to imagine. The suicide rate is very high, and in this group, and it's just terrible. It's almost 100,000 people in America every year that get this from auto injuries and things like this, and motorcycle injuries. In Connecticut, which doesn't have helmet laws, we have lots of people who end up like this. But this is just like completely untouched by medical science. There's nothing that we can do. And you're dealing with a problem where the brain has made these connections to the spinal cord when we were tiny embryos, and then as we grew and grew, these connections kind of stretched and stretched and stretched until an adult human. And the cells are, in our brain are like 20 microns, tiny little things, and they send these long fibers that travel all the way down to our spinal cord, and they of course, tell our spinal cord to move and do all the things that we do. And on the reverse, all these fibers that come up that carry all this information, tactile information about what we're touching and feeling. And when you cut that, all the nerve cells are still up there in the brain. They're still doing what they're doing. They're still saying, move your leg, move your arm. But nobody's listening. And those fibers cannot regrow. And there's been a lot of money on this spent on trying to get these things to regrow. But, the analogy I always use, it's like the size comparison would be if I was a nerve cell, that my arm would be, projecting all the way out and touching someone on their shoulder somewhere in North Carolina, right? That's the distances in the size relationship. And then somewhere in Delaware, my arm gets cut off, and then I have to blindly find my way with a new arm all the way back to that person's shoulder in that specific town and that specific, and that happened at a time when that person was right next to me. I essentially made the connection when they were standing next to me, and then as they moved all the way down to North Carolina, my arm just grew, But so the chances then later in life that my arm is going to be able to find its way down there with all those clues is essentially zero. So all this, I'm not really a big fan of a lot of this research is attempting to regrow these things. Unfortunately, I wish it was the case, but the idea that I'm going to somehow learn how to reach out and find that person when there's really no map to do that. There's a map when we're embryos. There's all kinds of things going on telling us what to do. There's also thousands and thousands of connections or millions of connections that are made that are pruned and removed as we grow through embryogenesis because they're misconnected. So it's a kind of a process of elimination. So there really isn't any way to retrain those neurons to find their way down there. So I saw this and sort of have thought to take a different approach to the process, which namely is kind of, since those cells are still in the brain and you're still able to say, move your arm, move your leg, but there's no way, can we bypass the damage and have a computer or through these methods grab that information in the brain and watch the nerve cells and watch you think, essentially, where you will say, I want to move my arm, and what are the nervous things that happen in your brain? What do the neurons do to instruct your arm to do that? And can we capture that signal and say, okay, your brain is saying it wants to do this, and feed that information to robotics and to computers and have them do it? And it's sort of a la the Matrix kind of thing where you could read that information, and I don't mean it in at all the sophisticated way it's portrayed in these kind of films. I mean more things like, can you move a wheelchair left? Can you move a wheelchair right? Can you open the door? Can you answer the phone? Start very simple with a series of commands that could be learned, And they can do that now with EEG and things like this, but we would like to go beyond that, where you can maybe write an email, where you could send an email, where eventually you could move a robotic arm would be the thing with, you'll never be able to play a piano maybe with the arm, but you don't really need the arm to play the piano. You may be able to think the notes and have it play that kind of thing. And so all that's feasible, really. It's actually feasible to do that because whatever you're capable of doing, all those commands have to have constructed in your brain. And what we lack really only is the ability to capture that information and translate it into what the outcome would be. So every time you go to play a C note on a piano, your brain creates a certain specific pattern of activity. And if we knew that pattern, and computers today are so powerful to deconstruct these, what seem to be rather abstract signals to our mind, computers can abstract those signals and say, take those huge data sets and crunch them and say, okay, that's what this is and that's what that is. But I looked at this whole process from capturing the information to processing information to the robotic action, and everything is in place to have this ready to go except the capturing of the information. So except for the ability to read out what the brain is doing in what I would say a non-invasive way, we don't have that yet, and that's the limiting technology. So I refocused my science several years ago to trying to fix that one problem, to try to fix the capturing of that information. Now, traditional way to do it is you put wire electrodes, unfortunately, and you record individual nerve cells on the tips of these tiny, fine wires that are half the thickness of a human hair. They go in, and with luck, they hit some of the cells. And people have done this kind of work in animals and have shown like amazing things. You can record maybe 100 neurons from a monkey, and you can, as the animal moves his arm around, you can reconstruct his movements exactly within a certain degrees of freedom by just the activity of 100 neurons in his brain, right? So as the animal moves his arm around, and in fact, in these experiments, if the animal moves his arm to sort of follow a cursor on the screen, you can have the computer understand what the animal's attempting to do before he's actually going to do it, and therefore move the object for the animal. And eventually the animal will stop actually moving his arm at all and just use his brain, and the computer will move it around on the screen on its own. And the animal will then take his arm and do something else with it. So the animal's scratching his butt while his brain is doing the computer games. And so the brain is able to sort of teach the computer how to do these things. And so if you see those experiments, and it just makes you think about the possibilities that exist in humans. These people who are just locked in. So this gentleman who they did, there's only 2 humans that have ever had these wires put into their brain, and a company in Massachusetts did it. And we interviewed this guy for our book, and he was really like overwhelmed by it and so excited by the notion of it. And unfortunately, they put these in him, and they only worked for a short time, and then they stopped giving a signal. But for him, it was the most exciting thing in his life because, he said for a moment he had control of something in his world. I mean, this is a guy who has to sit there and have people change him and bathe him and feed him and everything, right? And for a moment, he could do something with his own volition. It's just a completely empowering feeling, I think. And so even simple things to be able to do. So it's kind of been the goal, really. It's a long way to go, and it's a struggle, but it's the goal ultimately is to kind of help to get these people out of this prison of their ability to do anything. And that's the long answer to your question. The idea would be every time these nerve cells do their little thing, which is that every time everything we do, as I'm moving my hands, as we're talking, as you're thinking, all that is just lots of nerve cells firing. And those nerve cells are firing is what gives us consciousness, what lets us know who we are, what we're doing. Everything about us is basically those cells, right? And we have to be able to see those cells firing, and that they're firing, these action potentials are so their way of communicating with each other, and we have to listen to those conversations. That's the name of the game. And we have to listen to lots of conversations. There's just millions and millions of neurons in the brain involved in any one activity. So we need to record from some subset of those. We need to be able to see what they're saying. And of course, they're speaking a language which is very foreign to us. And we need to sort of see what they're speaking while we're doing something and train a computer to make that connection, that when Vincent's lifting his hand like this, these cells are doing something. When he does that, it's doing something different, And so we need to train the computer about all these activities. And then in the future, in this person, when they go to do something, it can just read those thought activity and have it do that action. So the people who were parallel, they had them sit in a chair and they said, imagine yourself picking up this coffee cup, or imagine yourself moving the joystick, or if there's a TV screen, imagine yourself moving a cursor in this direction or that direction. And then the brain cells will fire, computer captures that sequence of events, and then when that happens in the future, it will move the cursor that way, and when it sees a different sequence, it moves the cursor that way. And so our goal is to try to turn those little teeny conversations in brain cells, those electrical conversations, into little flashes of light, basically, so that every time a cell is talking, we can see it rather than having to put a little microphone down next to each one of them like we do now. This way, we just look at them, and then we run a very high-speed camera that would say, okay, he's talking, she's talking, that kind of thing. And then when this pattern of activity happens, that means this. When that pattern, that means that. So it's that little step between turning that information that's buried in the brain into something that's captured by the computer. It's just translating it, And the idea would be you with these proteins that we've been working with that come from coral, you can potentially image these things through the skull, through a thinned skull, per se, in a person, but directly through the skull. So you don't have to have all these, horribly, you imagine these horrible wires going to people's brains, and it's just, of course, if you're not really using your brain, in the case of people who are in that situation, and this guy who we interviewed was just more than glad to volunteer to do this, because really, essentially, he's not using much of his brain any longer. He can't feel anything from 90% of his body. He can't execute any function. So, so I think the FDA and these bodies are more allowed, more thinking about doing that, because these people really have no hope whatsoever anyway. And I think our goal is to kind of give them some kind of a functionality, return some functionality to them. So that's where the research focuses, and but it involves these little crazy proteins, which got us off on sort of a tangent to studying these strange proteins that come out of coral that help us do this. It was discovered a while ago that there was this strange protein, and these guys actually last year got the Nobel Prize for this protein because it's just so incredible. This is a really great story because it's a sort of story of a guy who back in the 60s was studying this jellyfish, that probably nobody in the world cared about, and he studied this jellyfish, and the jellyfish gives off light, and he was interested in why the jellyfish gave off light and how it gave off light. And so working in this tiny lab up in Washington State, he sort of extracted the chemical that was in this, that gave out light, and then there was this other protein that was kind of a contaminant that produced green light in this animal. Again, an obscure journal. The entire discovery is a footnote in an article that I think nobody read. For 30 years, nobody read the article. I think only 10 people read it, really. And then it was discovered that that little protein, you could put the DNA, and then the DNA revolution kind of happened during that time. You could take the DNA from that, and you could put it in any organism, and it makes the organism essentially fluoresce, which is this phenomenon where if you shine one color light, the cells will shine blue light, the cells will glow green, right? A phenomenon that we scientists found fascinating to use, So this obscure discovery, studying in this obscure animal, has become, first of all, a multi-billion-dollar industry, as well as it's just an amazing revolution in our field. It's allowed all fields of science to sort of see the workings of cells and see the workings of biology, which was normally invisible to us. So this single protein is now, expressed all over the world in all sorts of animals and organisms and all sorts of research labs, allowing this non-invasive study, And we saw this early on when this paper first came out and thought, well, maybe there are other proteins out there because this one is green. Maybe we can find other colored proteins. And then a paper came out saying, yeah, you can find them. So we were divers. My friend David Gruber, who's a professor here at CUNY, we decided, well, we're going to go down to Australia, which is the place to go for coral. And we spent a whole month there diving and looking around. And we, with a permit we have from the Australian government, we collected these tiny little fragments of coral that were kind of just lying around. And using these really powerful molecular techniques, could clone proteins, fluorescent proteins from those. And we cloned about 30 or 40 proteins from them that were new, different colors and different characteristics that we're now applying to these molecules I was telling you about, these little sensors. We're sort of taking these coral proteins and attaching them to other proteins and making sensors for recording brain activity. So and we're still in the field these days. We're heading to Israel in a few months to probably clone a few more of these things out of the Red Sea, because there's just an unlimited supply of them in the ocean with all sorts of features that we don't know about yet. So, in fact, the probe that we're interested in may already be out there in the ocean. There may be a voltage-sensitive one that we just haven't found yet. So much of the ocean and these things remains undiscovered genetically. So it's been an exciting kind of pastime to get you out of the lab a little bit, but it's been exhilarating to learn about how bizarre the world is underwater and how bizarre the biology is of those organisms, and how many tools that can help us cure diseases and be reporters for all kinds of things are there, just sitting there for people to go in and look for before they all vanish because we're destroying them at an unprecedented rate. We discovered going down, as we've seen since we were young, that coral reefs are probably like the bellwether of environments that are being destroyed. Like, they're getting destroyed faster than rainforests, but nobody really knows it because people don't see them. But I used to dive in the Florida Keys when I was a kid, and there's nothing to dive in the Florida Keys anymore. Basically the entire dive, business in Florida is gone because they destroyed all the reefs in Florida. And the reefs in Florida they're just mounds of dirt now, And there's some reefs in West Palm that are the only place that's left because there's no agriculture in West Palm, But in Florida, there's agriculture, there's divers that damaged it, and it's disaster, And it's a national park, It's crazy. It's completely destroyed. And so we have to fly to these exotic places, these sort of third world countries that still have beautiful reefs intact. It's the only place in America we have reefs is Florida. It's the only place with warm enough weather, and they're just devastated by our bad behavior, and it's very sad. So we watch these essentially what we call them libraries of ancient evolutionary information. These sequences which have developed over billions of years, just vanishing like overnight. They're just gone, and those things will take another billion years to come back. And so it's sad to see these answers and these solutions that are out there that we haven't reached yet just disappearing before our eyes, and so we're out there trying to sort of Noah's Ark them and pull them up and try to rescue their DNA before it's lost, because that DNA represents this like incremental improvement process that nature does, to solve these problems happening in billions of different species, moving along through history, and by wiping them out, these seemingly unimportant little organisms, we just lose that. God forbid that jellyfish was lost. 2 years after he finished cloning that thing, it disappeared completely from the bay where he found it. It just disappeared overnight. It was there in droves and went away one day, and nobody knows why it went away, but probably has something to do with us. It's been there for 1,000 years, and suddenly it's gone. So if he had missed that opportunity, we would not be, you and I wouldn't be having this conversation, and this would all, that there would have been Nobel Prize last year in this if that was gone. So for us, it's a sad. It's a daily reminder of how sad that story of conservation is, and how people can talk and talk and talk about what's going on, but we see it every day when you go diving. There's absolutely no doubt in anyone's mind that global warming, increasing all these things in the ocean, and human encroachment and high levels of bacteria and things that are in the water are just eliminating these treasure troves. They're not just beautiful to look at and dive on. They represent the second most complex biodiverse ecosystem in the world, bar none. And when they're gone, we've lost an enormous treasure, right? That's masked only by the rainforests, which we're also cutting down at an amazing rate. So not to be a downer, but that's something we're out there trying to kind of just do as much cloning as we can to because we're not going to fool ourselves to think that it's humankind is really going to change its behavior in the near future, and these things probably have. The sad thing is most reefs will probably be gone in 100 years. I mean, that's just unbelievable to say that. They've been this round of reefs have been on the earth for I don't know 50,000 years, and I'm saying that in 100 years most will be gone. That's a very conservative estimate. We rally. It's just a matter of nobody gives a damn what we say. I mean, this ridiculous Copenhagen business. I mean, it's just this politicized crap. It is. Most of us just can't be bothered, to listen to that. I mean, the last election, they asked all these Republican candidates how many of them believe in evolution, and they all said no. I mean, it's ludicrous. We all live and work with evolution every day in the labs, right? It's a fact, right? It's beyond it. It's like we know the sun's coming up in the morning, right? But we still find ourselves in a position arguing with people about something that we don't even argue anymore because it's no point in it, But because that doesn't really change our lives, we accept it as a fact. But when the leadership of our country doesn't even accept it, it's just amazing to me. And so I don't know how getting the concept of global warming out. You have all these scientists, diligently working on this, and then there's this notion that there's some sort of huge conspiracy amongst these guys who get paid nothing. They get nothing to do this. There's no vested interest in it whatsoever, right? I mean, they're not getting paid off by the anything. They're just doing it and they're discovering it. And they've been discovering it, and yet it's politicized into this. There's some agenda. Like I don't know. I can imagine there might be an agenda on the other side of why we, wouldn't want to stop using petroleum, for example. There might be a reason. There might be people with interest in that little material, but it's just sort of depressing, I guess, as scientists. And I was asked a while ago I was doing an interview about scientists in film, and they asked me to come back and talk about it. And I had a whole notion in my head about scientists are mistreated in film and how they always end up looking like crazy guys with wild hair, making mistakes and always rushing to greet the aliens just before they blow the world up kind of view of the scientists. But then I started reading about it, thinking about it a lot, and studying scientists in film, and realized that it's actually almost the opposite effect of scientists' appearance in society, especially in film, is that sometimes they're viewed as having even more influence in film than they actually do. You know, I always remember I was inspired when I was younger by Mr. Spock, because he was, like I said, he was always on the deck, and they'd run into something, and then they'd turn to the science guy, you know, tell us what's going on here. You know, like there was somehow a Mr. Spock in the White House that every time, you know, the president would find something, what about this global warming? And he'd turn to the guy. You know, and we used to have this thing in the National Academy of Science, which we still have, which was set up to be exactly that, you know, like, because the president was like a farmer, you know, and he's like, I don't know anything about science. And throw that question to the National Academy. The National Academy, a bunch of guys would sit around and think about it and come up with a, you know, it was an independent kind of body, and they'd give him an answer, and he'd kind of take it, you know, maybe he'd act on it. But today it's a joke, you know, they don't listen to anything they say. They constantly put reports out, and then they politicize. It's not like they ask them a question honestly to get an honest answer. And so I realized when I went back and did the interview that no, in fact, it's the fact that the appearance that scientists somehow have some influence on the process of government. And I think in the end, unfortunately, they really don't. Sometimes people listen, sometimes people don't, but they don't really, I don't think, direct much policy. Like, you can't see that in any way, shape, or form. And that's probably the saddest realization I had in life. That not that I want to have any influence, but I just think that maybe that the scientific approach to dealing with some problems in the world, like, for example, global warming, like energy issues, those are scientific problems. They're not really political problems. Sometimes we think they are, but there are scientific facts around those issues that are, you know, should just be addressed as that, you know, and not, it really doesn't help having Pat Robertson question scientific. It just doesn't make any sense to sort of, in this equivalent journalism concept, that we're going to take, you know, Richard Dawkins and we're going to put him up against, you know, a guy who just has a religious belief. It just doesn't make, it just seems ludicrous. It would be like taking like a world-renowned architect and then, you know, putting me and just say, well, I don't think that's correct. I think it should be done this way. I mean, you'd think that was kind of funny, right? But it isn't. For some reason, we have to submit to that all the time in this business, you know, that these people spend years training, and then they put them up against the guy who just has an opinion, you know, and then there's an equivalent weight there in some way, you know. Overwhelming scientific opinion about global warming, and then 8 guys over here that work for Exxon, and then, okay, well, there's an even balance. It's not an even balance, you know. So from our perspective, you know, diving in the water, I have to see it all the time. You know, we were just down in Bonaire, and of course Bonaire doesn't have a water treatment plant, and so the more there's tourism there, they just flush everything out in the ocean, right? So you dive in the water, and the nitrogen level is just going through the roof, you know. So, you know, they say, oh, it feeds through sandstone, so it's not raw sewage, but, you know, it's nitrogen, right? It's human waste. It ends up out there, and they don't like that, corals. And so they're just dying like crazy, you know. The Elkhorn coral there, that used to be these magnificent things, are just all gone. You know, you can see them. They're like these huge, you know, dead. You can see the majestic size of these things, where I never saw them because they were gone. I've never been there, but they're just these massive carcasses of coral. You know, you see the babies around, but then you see these massive things that were like the size of this room. You know, just enormous things gone because of you know, all the things that have happened on the island. So it's you see it with your eyes, and you don't understand why it's not easier to translate to people into simple solutions. You know, they're still waiting to get their loan from the European Union to finish building their waste processing plant, you know, and every year they wait. It's just something like a $20 million loan. I mean, so it's like ludicrous, that kind of money, you know. So it saddens you to see this kind of happening around you, and the loss of things that are more than just beautiful. As I say, they're kind of irreplaceable. They're irreplaceable human, you know, human resources that we have. That it's not like, it's things that once those genes are gone, we can't get them back, you know. We got to wait 1 million years, you know. We certainly won't be here for that. So I guess I have a sort of corporate side to my life, as developing drugs for treat neurological conditions. And so, you know, there's a huge contingent of scientists, I guess, that work in corporations that are either drug companies or engineers developing things like that, and they're secretive. I mean, in that sense, just as all business is secretive. I think academic scientists, you know, as compared to almost any function I know, are more transparent, I think. I mean, I think it's a perfect model in many ways. I mean, okay, there's always problems with these things, but comparing it to just about any other way of functioning, the scientific approach is in its essence is a way to go, because what we do is we do an experiment, and then we write in detail how we did it, and then we publish the results. And what that does is that allows everyone else to redo it. So I can lie, okay? I can easily make up experimental results. That's easy. But when I have to write how I did it, then a person can come along and redo it. I always say it's different from a courtroom where two lawyers get together and they fight over something that happened in the past that nobody can recreate. And whoever creates a better, more plausible, believable version of the past, even if it's not real, sort of wins the trial. It's not the case with us. We have to do something, and everything we do has to be repeatable, you know? So everybody has to be able to go and repeat my science. And so I can lie, but ultimately it has to be repeated. But I think what you're getting at in that terms is that certainly corporations and places that do science related to cars and automobiles are not transparent, certainly are not. I mean, they have a competitive advantage to remain non-transparent. But that's where the government kind of has to play a role, I guess. I think that the thing about us is that, you know, we're academic scientists, which means we're required by our universities to disclose everything we do. I mean, what we're there for is to serve the public good. That's all we do. We do all this work, we spend all this money, and our output is papers, right? We don't make hamburgers, we don't make cars, we make stuff that people read only, right? That's all we do. And we're required to disclose what we do. And we're required to go through a lot of issues, you know, we're required to not have conflicts. In other words, I'm not allowed to get money from a drug company, theoretically, and then work on research in that company, which would, you know, taint my, I don't want to publish bad results because I have stock in the company kind of notion. But those are gray areas, and there's a lot of discussion around, you know, how much are we allowed to do that kind of work, because it can make our work a little less transparent, you know. And unfortunately, when there's large amounts of money involved, which is what you'd have in the transportation and auto industry and the pharmaceutical business, it encourages dishonesty. It encourages people to, you know, okay, well, let's ignore that because, you know, that's going to hurt the development of this drug in the future. And you see this all the time when drugs come out and we find that they have all these problems with them. But I think in the basic science, you know, in the academic science, I think it's a model in some way. I'm surprised. I think that's why government funding things in an open fashion helps research move forward. And, you know, not to have another plug again for government funding, but it's the only place I think American citizens can see that their dollars are being put to work in the scientific arena in an open fashion. You know, we publish everything. And now, you know, everything is in the public domain, basically. When I write something, I have to publish it. I can't keep it to myself. I can't share it only amongst my group, you know. So it's a way for the public to get their money's worth, to get things done. And car companies can take those ideas, drug companies take those ideas all the time and turn them into large profits. You know, all the discoveries that drug companies develop drugs with come out of our laboratories, come from tax dollars ultimately, right? And I think, you know, as soon as it leaves us and moves into the corporate setting, it's no longer transparent. And so I guess I'm just a real proponent of government funding, and this horrible idea of big government's bad. Big government isn't really that bad when it uses the dollars in that direction, I think. You know, I guess I'm a big fan of American capitalism as well, and having an advantage is important. I think the patent system in this country is a disaster, you know, and so getting patents approved is like something out of Alice in Wonderland. It's this unbelievably bizarre. You submit a patent, they reject it outright. Every patent gets outright rejected since the examiners seem to make money off of rejection. And so they reject everything, and then you spend the next year in, you know, $25,000 in lawyer fees working your way back to getting an approved patent, which is what you submitted in the first place, you know. And it's just that's why huge patent attorney business, right? So this process is ridiculous, but corporations have to do this because we live in a world where a lot of research gets put into some idea, and then it makes it to the market, and there's a lot of other people who will come in and just take it, you know. And I'm a big believer in, if people do research and come up with a good product, it shouldn't be stolen. You know, they should be able to make their money back because that encourages future investment, you know. It's hard to say, you know, to develop a drug these days, that's the area that I'm most familiar with, it costs hundreds of millions of dollars, right? And if at the end of the day a company makes a drug and it goes to market and somebody can just take it, you know, a generic just takes the drug and starts selling it, you know, from a consumer perspective, that seems like a good idea because the drug costs this amount a month, and now the cost goes way down with the generics. But on the other hand, all that R&D that went into the development of that drug, all those people who were paid, all those investors, they all lose their money, you know, and they're not going to do that in the future, and you're not going to get the next drug. So there has to be a balance between, you know, corporations who have to extend, you know, and I don't want to be on the side of defending a large pharmaceutical company, but they extend huge amounts of money up front to these drugs make it to market, as do cars. You know, cars cost a lot of money to develop, and if, you know, they hit out the door and they don't have patent protection because of the difficulty of the patent, and someone just steals their ideas, then how do their investors make their money back, you know? And it's a real world problem. I mean, right now a lot of these generic companies have huge legal departments that are just there to like beat patents, and so someone has a great idea, they really work hard to get this drug to market through all these obstacles and odds, and work through all the problems. It gets to market after multi-millions of dollars, and a generic company breaks the patents, they can start selling the drug at half the price or a quarter of the price. They're not going to make their money back, and it's not going to encourage future development. I mean, these developments of these complicated things like drugs and cars takes a lot of people, a lot of time, and a lot of money. And I think if you don't help ensure investors that they're going to see something at the end of all that investment, they're not going to invest in it any longer, And so I think that I've personally come across drugs which don't have patentability. Oh, I'm sorry. I went down. I personally have come across a number of interesting therapeutics that we can't develop because they don't have any intellectual property behind them. I mean, not interesting, things that work. I mean, we have drugs there are drugs out there that all these guys know that work. They just won't be developed and put into humans because you can't protect it. You're not going to spend $100, $200, $300 million to get a drug to market so that, a generic company can start selling it. It's just you don't get your money back, right? And so they won't do it. They'll go off and look for things that are. And there's a whole space out there full of these things that will never see the light of day because we have rules like the Hatch-Waxman law, which says if you get something to market, you get a certain number of years of exclusivity. Well, in the U.S., that's like a 5 or 6 year exclusivity. In Europe, it's much longer. So that patents are not that big of an issue. If I get something on the market, I'm going to at least given a certain number of years of exclusivity to sell my product. That doesn't exist in most of the rest of the world. I think that the Congress recognized that it's very expensive to develop drugs, and so nobody's going to go out and make those outlays, if they can't see something downstream, So that's part of the healthcare debate, in a sense. There's a part of the healthcare bill that includes extending that exclusivity period. And it accepts some people because they think, oh, it's longer before we get to the generics and stuff like that. But on the other hand, it's going to encourage a lot more investment into the process of making drugs. I mean, America leads the world on making drugs because America leads the world on capital that can be deployed to do these kind of. So the issue of transparency is a two-way street. It's only so good if things are. Transparency obviously encourages scientific discovery and reduces duplication. I'm not doing the same experiment that you're doing, that kind of thing. But when it gets into the corporate sphere, it's hard to do that in a way that you just don't get your lunch eaten. And people will eat your lunch, for sure they will. There's a lot of people out there waiting to do that. So it tends to blunt creativity, and that's why the patent system was put in place years ago. I mean, that's what a patent was meant to be. It was meant to reward the person and encourage development if you have a great idea that someone else can't steal it.